Right? At least that's been my experience. I did manage to, actually, Hans and Tim and Yo and I managed to take in the parade last night downtown. It was quite fascinating with a lot of really nice floats. And I was really encouraged that the announcer was very forthright about the various Christian groups in the parade. I don't think I could get away with it in Detroit. I think the American Civil Liberties Union did come down on our heads like a ton of bricks if we talked about the stuff they talked about last night. I mean, they talked about the birth of Jesus, and a couple of times they read passages from the Bible and so on. It was quite encouraging. Anyway, it was an enjoyable evening. As Yo said, I'm Dan. I'm from the Detroit area. I'm just recently retired from two things, actually. One from a professorship at a college and the other as a pastor. So we'll see what we can do with the book of Judges today. I should say at the very beginning that all questions are welcome. There are no bad questions. There are bad answers, and I'll try to avoid them if I can. But all questions are welcome, so feel free. And I see you have your Bible because we're going to actually look at it in some places. We don't actually know who wrote this book. In fact, we're not sure that it was a person who wrote the book more than there was a person who compiled the information. Generally, this is a kind of a book that we see from multiple ancient sources that are brought together into a book. We don't really know who did that, but I'll show you one reason why we think it was compiled from some pre-existing sources. For one thing, look, if you will, at chapter 1 and verse 21. In chapter 1 and verse 21, it says, "The Benjamites failed to dislodge the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem, and to this day the Jebusites live there with the Benjamites." Now that presupposes that this part of the book was written while Jerusalem is still belonging to Canaanite peoples. That means that part has to be earlier than David, because David is the one who took the city of Jebus and turned it into an Israelite city called Jerusalem. Okay? Then, if you look at 9:16, you'll see another kind of reference, which says, I'm sorry, 1 Kings 9:16. This is, of course, within the reign of Solomon. And it says that Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and this is probably Simeon, Pharaoh Simeon of Egypt, had attacked and captured Gezer. Now, in the book of Judges, in 129, it says that Gezer is still in the hands of the Canaanites too. So, if you're back in the book of Judges, then some parts of this, at least, have to be fairly early, prior to the times of David and Solomon. On the other hand, if you look at 1830 in the book of Judges...
I'm confused. You're saying that the second reference in 1 Kings 9:16, that the Pharaoh gave captured Gezer, killing the Canaanite population, and gave the city to his daughter as a wedding gift when she married Solomon.
But you connect that to 129 in Judges. I'm sorry, I think I didn't say that, so I should have said that, sorry. But in 129 in Judges, it says that the Canaanites were still living in Gezer. Okay, so if we know that Gezer comes under the Israelite hegemony during the time of Solomon, and at the time this part of the text is written, the Canaanites are still living there, that means it's got to be earlier than Solomon. Because if it was after Solomon, you couldn't say that. Does that make sense? With me so far? Still a little fuzzy? I can be fuzzy. I can be quite fuzzy, actually.
I've noticed that just in reading through, the Jebusites seem to be there too long.
Yeah.
When you're reading Judges,
yeah. So they're still living there. Whenever this text is written, they're still living there. So that has to be before David, and in Gezer they're still living there. So that has to be before Solomon. Okay. Now, if you go to 1830, however, you have a very different kind of statement in Judges 18:30, which says that the Danites set up for themselves the idols, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses, and his sons were priests for the tribe of Dan until the time of the captivity of the land. Now you've got a reference that goes all the way to the exile, and the exile is going to be, depending on whether it's talking about the north or the south, but even if it's the north, it's going to be 722 BC. So that's a long time after David and Solomon. You've got to be able to talk about the captivity of the land as though it's an accomplished fact, so that puts you quite late. And so you've got two kinds of internal evidence, one that's early and one that's late. And this is one reason why we suppose that maybe the book of Judges was some original pieces, some written earlier, some written later, that are brought together. Does that make sense, why we're talking about that? Okay. Then near the end of the book of Judges, you have this statement 4 times. You probably noticed it when you were reading. In those days there was no king.
Yeah.
That's the sort of thing you say after there was a king. For instance, if I say, in those days Hawaii wasn't a state, that means that I'm living in the time when it is a state, because I'm reflecting back before. And so this statement, in those days there was no king, presupposes that now we are at least in the time of Saul, David, Solomon, or later. Okay? So those are the kind of internal factors that suggest to us that this book may have been composed out of some pre-existing material. There's some other reasons as well, and those are linguistic, and that is that the book of Judges contains some of the earliest forms of the Hebrew language that we currently possess, particularly in the poetry, such as the poetry of the Song of Deborah. The language there is very ancient. In fact, many of the words we do not know what they mean. It's a very early period of the language. The narrative of the story of Deborah, which is more of a storyline, seems to be later Hebrew, but the poetry seems to be very, very early. So, in any case, it seems likely that the narratives come from more than a single period. Now, you have just finished, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the book of Joshua last week. This is what it was supposed to have looked like. I say supposed to have looked like because it didn't quite look like this when you get done to the book of Joshua. But this is the way that Joshua actually distributed the land. But one of the things you've noticed when you read the book of Judges is that this little section here, 10, which is Dan, doesn't stay. When you get to the end of the book of Judges, the Danites are going to move way up to the north. I don't really have a pointer, but up there at the top of 6, basically. So they're going to relocate. So this is the way it should have looked like, but not the way it actually ended up looking like. And there's a couple of other anomalies. One is that if you look really carefully at 12, the tribe of Simeon is right down here. Well, the tribe of Simeon disappears pretty early in the record. We don't know why. They just quit talking about the tribe of Simeon. It just doesn't come up anymore. It's like you got 6 kids and you never talk about the last one, and that often means he died or something. So Simeon seems to be absorbed into Judah. So when you've got some sort of question marks about Simeon, you also have question marks about Reuben, because Reuben also disappears from the discussion in the biblical text very early and just don't talk about him anymore. So probably the Reubenites might have merged with the Gadites in 7. And then furthermore, as you read the book of Joshua really carefully, you'll notice that Joshua says there are a lot of areas that we're still not in control of.
Right.
And so he's urging the people, take control of these areas. And when you get to the book of Judges, you find that really is a threat. There are significant threats. So even though this is what it was supposed to have looked like, this is what it actually looked like. All of the striped area are the areas where the Israelites are living. But the other areas, like down in here, this kind of color, solid color, those are areas where the Israelites are not successful. And the one thing that is really very apparent geographically is all of these areas where the Israelites are not successful are flatlands. And all the area where they are successful are mountainous. So the Israelites seem to do really good in the mountains, but they're not very good down in the flat areas. And the book of Judges actually tells us why. Because the enemies had chariotry. Chariotry doesn't work good in the mountain, but it works really good when it's flat. Okay, so they had a real challenge with chariotry, and the Israelites themselves didn't use chariots, they just used infantry. And so they did good up in the mountains, but not so good on the flat areas, and they had a lot of difficulty with that. So the occupation, as it was in reality, is the firm areas of control are in the central mountains, and the Transjordan over here, east of the Jordan, and the weakest areas are the coastal plain, which is this area here, and then the Jezreel Valley, which is a very wide, flat area up here. So, any question about that? Does that all make pretty much sense? All right, here's just kind of a real brief overview. You have a preface at the beginning. We're going to talk about that today. You have major cycles, which are, I apologize, I forgot to turn this off, and my wife is trying to get a hold of me, and she's going to have to wait. Well, turn off. There we go. I apologize. I really scold the people in my church for doing this, and then I'm doing it myself, you know. Big signs on the door, you know, be sure you turn off your cell phone before you come in. So we'll probably look at Ehud and Deborah today, and then we'll save Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson, and the rest for next Sunday. And then there are a couple of appendices at the end that talk about this migration of the Danites and the civil war with Benjamin. So these are the 6 major judges. Now there's some minor judges as well that are just kind of briefly noted. It's usually just like a 1 or 2 line thing, and you don't really know much about them. But these are the ones where you have more lengthy stories, and we'll try to talk a little bit about those. And if you have questions about the others, please feel free to ask.
I have a question.
Yes.
In general about the judges.
Yeah.
Since there was no king and the tribes are spread all out.
Yep.
What was the role of the judge? And was there just one, or were there many over the territory?
Well, that's a question that's a little tricky. The term judge, or judges, which is the term shofet in Hebrew, doubles for 2 kinds of people. One, a magistrate who actually hears what we would call civil cases, usually conducted in a city gate, where the elders of the city and the plaintiff, whoever, he's got a property issue or whatever he's got, but anyway, they talk to the elders, and the judge is sort of the last say, the magistrate. One of the judges we know for sure did that sort of thing, and that's Deborah. She held court. Okay, so that's a magistrate kind of role. But primarily in the book of Judges, the judges are warriors. It doesn't say much about their administrative capacities. Maybe they had them, but it talks a lot about their warrior status. And so that's the other sort of definition for a judge, is that they are warriors sent to deliver God's people, or raised up to deliver God's people from their enemies. Yeah. So that's a good question.
So a judge was the judge over the entire Israel?
No, probably local. Probably in his own tribe. If you go back to the Torah, particularly the book of Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy, Moses appoints magistrates for local tribes. Okay, so these judges are probably for local areas. For instance, Deborah is going to be up in the north. She's probably in the area near Galilee. That's sort of her range. Later in the book of 1 Samuel, you'll find Samuel as a judge, but he's further south. Okay, he's kind of in the middle part of Israel. So they're probably local, and probably the judges, even as warriors, are more local. There is a theory by the Jewish rabbis that's in the Talmud that says each of the judges came from a different tribe. Each of them, none of them were over everybody. Each of them were over one piece of the tribal structure of Israel. Now, I don't know whether we should give undue weight to that tradition, because the Talmud is still hundreds of years later than the events. But at least that was a very traditional idea among the Jews, is that there was one judge per tribe at different times. Yeah. So here's the question I have for you. It's commonly assumed that under Joshua, the Israelites took full possession of the land. How do the books of Joshua and Judges speak to that assumption? And we often talk about, well, Joshua went and he conquered the land. And there's some verses that say that.
Taking possession of it could mean that they occupy it, but that they don't control it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really important distinction. Many of the raids of Joshua were what we would call, militarily speaking, crippling attacks. But they weren't full occupation results, where they took over the city and they all moved in and so on. But they were military attacks that crippled the military of the Canaanites, but there's still a lot of stuff that's kind of up for grabs. And the book of Joshua actually says that, and the book of Judges makes that abundantly clear.
And the fact that they didn't kill them all. They didn't.
Yeah, no. In fact, there's a list of things. They didn't burn this city. They didn't burn that city. They didn't do this to that city. Yeah.
They let them live.
That's right. To their great regret, in many cases. Yeah.
When Judges talks about how the Lord left certain tribes to
Yes.
the Israelites.
Yes, because they didn't follow through on their part. God says, then I'm not following through on my part because you're not following through on your part. Okay, so I'm going to leave these people here. And they're going to be thorns in your side. They're going to be a problem for you. And I'm going to let that happen because you were not faithful to my covenant in what I told you to do when you went in. Yeah, absolutely. By the way, we go to 10 o'clock. Okay, I want to be sure I have that. So basically, the book of Judges is largely a picture of covenant failure. I want you to turn to a psalm that talks about the book of Judges. Psalm 106. And notice the language of this psalm. The psalm talks about, first of all, the people in Egypt. If you read the whole psalm, it starts out in Egypt, and it goes through through Moses and all the stuff that happened in the wilderness. But then in verse 34, you pick up where they got into the land with the book of Judges, and it says, they did not destroy the peoples as the Lord had commanded them, but they mingled with the nations and adopted their customs. They worshiped their idols, which became a snare to them. They sacrificed their sons and their daughters to demons. They shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan. And the land was desecrated by their blood. They defiled themselves by what they did, and by their deeds they prostituted themselves. And therefore Yahweh was angry with his people and abhorred his inheritance. He handed them over to the nations, and their foes ruled over them. Their enemies oppressed them and subjected them to their power. Many times he delivered them, but they were bent on rebellion, and they wasted away in their sin. But he took note of their distress when he heard their cry, and for their sake he remembered his covenant. Out of his great love he relented and caused them to be pitied by all who held them captive. And then it ends with a prayer, save us, O Lord, and gather us from the nations. That description of the Psalms is really graphic in describing the sort of in a broad way what happens in the book of Judges. So the book of Judges is essentially about covenant failure. The Israelites were unable to conquer the various Canaanite enclaves because of the iron chariots. By the way, in terms of world history, we are right on the cusp of the change from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Okay, that's an important thing. I'm not sure that most of us know a lot about metallurgy, but what's the difference between bronze and iron? What would be the advantage in one over the other?
Bronze is softer.
Softer, so iron holds a much sharper edge, especially for weapons. If you're going up against a guy with a bronze sword and you have an iron sword, you're probably you got a bit of an advantage there. On the plus side for bronze, it melts at a lower temperature. Iron requires a much hotter fire. And in fact, they're just now learning how to get a fire hot enough to actually smelt iron. That's sort of the changeover from bronze to iron. So this is part of the picture of the book of Judges. As you get into the book of 1 Samuel, which comes right after this, you'll find that the main iron smelters in the land of Canaan are going to be the Philistines. And the Israelites are going to have to go down there to get anything done in iron. They don't quite have the technology yet to smelt iron. So you're right in this changeover period from one major technology to another, kind of like the difference between me using a typewriter and learning how to use a computer or something like that. It's a major change.
So just out of curiosity, in regards to the Israelites essentially not being able to conquer the places that were into iron.
Yeah.
Would that be indicative of a failure on their part to embrace the new technology, or would that be a stretch?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure we can answer it definitively. Yeah. The new technology, at least the way I read the text in 1 Samuel, seemed to be protected by the Philistines. Yeah. They had it and they wanted to keep it within their domain. Sort of like Microsoft. You know, they know the technology and they won't let you have it. Okay, so I tend to think it was not so much a reluctance on the part of the Israelites as much as they didn't have the technology, they didn't know how to get it. I'm not sure, though. That's a guess.
Yeah. So then I'm thinking of God's command for them to go occupy.
Sure.
Occupy, take dominion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Area.
How does that work?
How does that work?
Well, I think it works this way, that God seems to typically take people who are at a technological disadvantage and make up for that by divine act. For instance, when we get to the story of Gideon, he gets all his men together and sends most of them home. Why does God do that? Because he wants to be sure they know this is not their military strategy, it's God. And in a way, I think the bronze versus iron chariots is the same kind of thing. God, in a sense, leaves his people at a disadvantage to show, and I'm borrowing a term from the New Testament, but to show that the all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. So I think, you know, in that way, that kind of idea may apply.
Well, I was wondering, too, when we brought this subject up, is that the Israelites weren't nomadic to the degree that they weren't going all over the world. They weren't going down the Silk Road into China.
No.
And I think
they're basically farmers and ranchers.
Exactly, farmers and ranchers. So they stayed in one spot.
That's right.
Whereas, weren't the Philistines, didn't they travel all over and weren't they more nomadic?
Well, they made one really big trip. They came from the Aegean to this end of the Mediterranean. So they made one big trek. Now, after they got established on the coastline of Palestine, they seem to have stayed there in the lowlands. But they were on the hunt for new territory.
Because I thought that to some degree the smelting of iron, the creation of the bellows and creating the hotter fire occurred, I thought it occurred in China.
Well, it was occurring in more than one place. It did occur in China, but it was also happening in Crete. The Philistines probably carried it with them down to the south coast, because the Philistines essentially came from the Aegean. They came from the old Mycenaean civilization. One of the difficulties about technology and language is who got started first? Well, it's kind of up for grabs a little bit. I mean, you got China and you've got Greece in one sense, and then in terms of language, you've got Egypt and you've got Mesopotamia. Who started it? Well, written language. Well, they're about the same time, so it's kind of hard to say.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the discussion. The questions are great. Keep them coming. Because of this military failure, which is regarded as covenant failure, in fact, I want to point that out, particularly notice chapter 2, verse 20 of Judges. Then the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant that I laid down to their forefathers and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their forefathers did. So this is understood to be a covenant failure. And so the Canaanites are going to live intermingled with the Israelites. And in addition, treaties and intermarriage with the Canaanites is a breach of covenant law. These are strictly forbidden to create treaties with them or to have intermarriage with them. Who is maybe one of the striking examples of someone who intermarries with somebody else's tribal group out of Israel? Would be Samson. He marries a Philistine, and he seems fascinated by Philistine women for some reason. I mean, his marriage doesn't last very long, but it doesn't stop him. He still keeps going down there. So he's got this Philistine fixation, so to speak. So the generation after Joshua was marked by continued covenant failure and religious syncretism. Now this is, I don't know if this is a term you use typically, but syncretism means mixing things, the mixing of religion, the mixing of the worship of Yahweh with the worship of Canaan. That becomes part of the problem. So there's this judgment at Bokim when the angel of the Lord, I probably shouldn't have said Malach Yahweh, since that probably is a register. That's the Hebrew word for the angel of the Lord, okay? The angel of the Lord left Gilgal, the site of Joshua's original military encampment, appears at Bokim, which is a name that means the weepers. In fact, many of your Bibles will have a footnote there to tell you what that name means. And this is a signal that the Israelites have failed. He pronounces the sentence of judgment upon them that we read part of a moment ago. Now the Lord no longer is going to drive out the Canaanites, so they're living side by side. And that's going to lead us to a bunch of cycles in which the Israelites are going to fall into apostasy. After apostasy, they're going to be oppressed by the Canaanites around them. Then they're going to repent because of their waywardness. Then God will send them a judge to deliver them. They'll have a period of peace. And then in a relatively short time, they fall off the wagon again. And they just keep kind of running around the same little cycle. And it goes over and over again in this book. Sounds kind of like us, doesn't it? Yeah, I think you're right. That's very human. You know, the problems I have are the problems I had 20 years ago sometimes. You know, it's part of being a fallen human. And I can say one thing. I mean, there's certain things that fade with age. That's one nice thing about getting older is certain kinds of things fade. But I still have as big a problem, I think, as I ever had with loving my neighbor as myself. I find that statement of Jesus to be incredibly challenging. I really like the line from the old Book of Common Prayer that's been used for centuries by Christians. We have not loved you with our whole heart. We have not loved our neighbors as ourselves. I say that virtually every Sunday in church, and every time I know it's true. I haven't loved God with my whole heart, and I haven't loved my neighbor as myself, and I am heartily sorry, as the ancient prayer says. This is a challenge, and I would suppose this will be a challenge until the day I die, as long as I'm a human being. My tendency as a human is to be self-centered, self-sufficient, self-preoccupied, yeah. Yep, judgmental, all of those kind of things, yeah. So by the end of the period of the Judges, the Israelites are seriously threatened by the Philistines, which are the remnants of what are called the Sea Peoples that have invaded Egypt. and now have settled on the south coastland of Canaan. So another question here. Does Israel's ancient relationship to the Canaanites have any bearing upon the modern Christian's relationship to the world? What do you think about that? Do you think that this book has something to say to us, besides just being a rather fascinating piece of ancient history?
Yeah, absolutely not. That'd be too challenging.
Well, maybe to ask the question is to answer it without much further, but I do think that these kind of things in the Old Testament do have something to say to us as Christians. In the New Testament, Paul will say, these things were written for our instruction, upon whom the end of the ages has come, so that we will not do as they did. So that means that this has a relevance for us. These stories may not be about us, but they're certainly for us, and they have something to say to us as modern Christians. Yeah, Tim.
So do you think if we initially are obedient to God, that we won't go through this recurring cycle that...
Well, I think we can, and often do. I think we do kind of sometimes go through cycles like that, where we...
You're doing it right now. I mean, with all the Syrian refugees, Afghanistan, all of that.
We get it together, and then we fall off the wagon, and we need to, and then we have to come back to God and say, okay, I've messed it up again,
It seems like he promised initially that they wouldn't have to go through this cycle.
Sure.
Which is that surprising to me.
So Martin Luther, for instance, has a classical term, which I won't repeat to you in Latin, which is what he did it in, but it says, you are at once both a saint and a sinner. And I think there's a great deal of truth in that. I'm not a Lutheran, but I do agree with Luther a fair amount of the time. And I think he's right on, that we are at once a saint and a sinner. As a Christian, we both have within ourselves the seeds of our fallenness, but we also have the holiness of Christ that's been imputed to us in the cross, and so we are both at one time these things. Well, you can think about that. You don't have to agree with me on that, okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about Canaanite religion. Canaanite religion was apparently very attractive to the ancient Israelites, and until relatively recently, and by relatively I mean within the last half century or so, we knew very little about Canaanite religion. But back in the middle part of the last century, there was a major discovery at a place called Ras Shamra, which its ancient name was called Ugarit. And what we discovered was an ancient library of about 20,000 clay tablets, which were texts written, actually many of them earlier than the time of the judges, but back in this period of time. And many of them had to do with Canaanite religion and how Canaanite religion worked and who the gods and goddesses were and what the practices were. And so since that time, we have gained a much better understanding of how Canaanite religion actually functioned. This is one of those texts right here. This is called the Baal Epic, or if you're used to saying Baal, that's fine. I'm probably going to say Baal, but don't let that bother you. Okay, it's discovered in Ugarit, and it describes Baal as the Lord of the earth, and he's constructing a palace on Mount Zaphon when he is attacked by Yam, the god of the sea, and then was imprisoned by Mot in the underworld, Mot the god of death. And he stays in the underworld for a time, and then he has a female consort who is the goddess of war and sex, who rescues him from the underworld and brings him back up. The two of them mate, and they create fertility in the world. It begins to rain, the crops begin to grow, the goats begin to have, kids, and so on and so on. So we understand a lot about this from texts like this one. Canaanite religion was essentially a fertility religion which used imitative magic to induce fertility in land and people and livestock and so on. The gods and goddesses were male and female. The main god, Baal, was the god of rain, lightning, and storm. That's interesting. Everybody's probably familiar with the story of Elijah and the Canaanite prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, you know, when the God who answers by fire. The Hebrew word for fire is also the Hebrew word for lightning. And so this is a real in-your-face challenge by Elijah. The God who answers by lightning or fire is really God. Well, Baal is supposed to be the God of lightning and fire, except he can't seem to get anything started. And then at the end of the scene, of course, it's Elijah who prays, and kaboom! God answers by lightning and fire and burns up the altar and everything. But that's the characteristic of Baal. He's the god of rain, the god of lightning, storm. Mot is the god of death, who is in control during the dry season. So every year has its cycle of the wet season and the dry season. The wet season is necessary, of course, for the crops, but once you get them harvested in, you get into the dry season, and then you kind of wait until the next season. So this is all part of the mythology. In the spring, Ashtaroth, who is the goddess of sex and war, rescues Baal from the power of Mot. And Baal and Ashtaroth mate. And the mating of the deities is believed to cause fertility. Now, here's the ritual part of Canaanite practice. The Canaanites practiced sacred prostitution in order to, in a magical way, get Baal and Ashtaroth to mate. In other words, they felt that they could to some degree control the actions of the gods by their rituals. That's the reason I call it imitative magic. And so, the mating of Baal and Ashtaroth is incited by sacred prostitution at the high places. What later one of the prophets is going to say happened on every high hill and under every green tree. This was something that God abhorred, something that he wanted his people to stay away from. One of the reasons he wanted the Israelites to actually clean out the Canaanites, because otherwise they would follow in that kind of thing. And in fact, that's what's going to happen in the book of Judges. They are going to follow in this kind of thing. And so there are both male and female sacred prostitutes. There are Hebrew words for that, the Kodashim and the Kodashot, that serve in these public temples and open-air sites. So this is part of the stuff that God wants them to stay away from, but that they seem to continually keep falling back into. If you ever want to know what Baal looks like, this is him. This is the best we can do with an ancient photographic portrait. Well, not really photographic. This is in the Louvre in Paris. If you ever get there, you can go have a look at it. You can see Baal usually wears a conical hat. You see his kind of conical hat there, and he's got a conical hat here. He often carries a lightning branch, except this one has a spear on one end and lightning on the other. This one, it's been broken off, but we assume that he was carrying a lightning bolt or something similar to this one. And then this is the pedestal of Baal, which is a bull. The bull sometimes will actually have Baal depicted on the back of it, not astride like a cowboy, but actually standing on the back of it with his feet along the back ridge, okay? There's another image of that in the Louvre in Paris that's really striking, which I'm not showing you for time's sake. But anyway, the bull calf is a symbol of the pedestal of the gods. So any ideological similarity between our modern sexually permissive society and the promiscuity of ancient Canaanites? I'd say quite a lot, probably. And moving further that direction all the time. So again, these texts may have something to say to modern people. This is one of the most ancient depictions of Canaanites and maybe Israelites that we have. This was excavated from about 1200 BC, which is going to put it right squarely in the period of the Judges. This is ivory, and it depicts a Canaanite king. He's sitting on a throne with a cherubim. If you look carefully, and I'm not sure how the graphics came out on that, whether you can actually see it on your paper, but there's a winged cherub up here, like a sphinx. Okay, and then presenting to him are people bringing gifts, a musician, and then some prisoners of war. Now the prisoners of war are naked and they are circumcised. That's apparent when you look very, very close. So these may actually be one of the earliest depictions of Israelites who are being brought before a Canaanite king as prisoners of war. Then there's a chariot back here with a chariot rider and so on. So it's a really interesting artifact from very, very early that depicts life about the time we're talking about. There's also a winged sun disk. This is a symbol of the gods. The little circle in the middle is supposed to be the sun, and the wings are like the rays of the sun, but they are often depicted as wings. Very typical of that iconography.
What other people group would be circumcised?
Well, that's why we're not sure these are Israelites, because there are a number of other peoples who were circumcised. The only ones we know who were not circumcised were the Philistines. They didn't practice it, but the Canaanites and the Egyptians as well practiced circumcision, but a little differently than the Hebrews. The Hebrews practiced circumcision at what early date for a baby? Do you remember? 8 days. On the 8th day, they were circumcised. The Canaanites and the Egyptians practiced circumcision for young men as a puberty ritual. And so they were probably teenagers before that happened for them. So because of the fact that there are other people, we're not absolutely sure these are Israelites, but they very well could be. So that's a little bit fuzzy. Yeah. Did you notice how many passages talk about the Holy Spirit moving on the judges as you're reading through this? It happens quite a number of times. This sort of war, the inciting, the leadership for war comes from the Holy Spirit, because all war in the ancient world was religious war. We don't think of war today necessarily in quite the same terms. But in the ancient world, all war was not only a war between two peoples, it was a war between two deities. So when you went to war, you went under the auspices of your patron god or goddess, and you fought against someone else's patron god and goddess. So in many of the depictions of war, you will find over the soldiers little depictions of the gods and goddesses, because the gods and goddesses are at war too. And basically, if you win, what are you saying? My God is bigger than your God. That's right. And normally the first thing you do to an attacked city when you overcome it is you destroy their temple. This is the reason the Babylonians destroyed the temple in Jerusalem much later, is because it was sort of war protocol. Yeah. So it's all religious in character. Wars against the Canaanites are intended as judgments. According to the book of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, these were judgments upon the Canaanites because of their sins. The empowering force of the Spirit was at the heart of the war effort, and so there's quite a number of passages that talk about that. And so we sometimes refer to the judges as charismatic leaders. Now, by that, I don't mean that they're charismatic in the way we talk about modern religious groups, but the fact that they are not dynastic. They don't come because their father was a leader. They are just simply moved upon by the Holy Spirit, and then they become a leader. Starting with Ehud of Benjamin, we got about 15 minutes, and I think we can cover Ehud and Deborah just fine. I've kind of got some of this intro stuff out of the way, which I'm hoping this will be helpful and valuable as you read this book. Let me stop here and see if there are any questions about the sort of this broad stroke introduction. Okay. All right, let's try. Let's everybody learn how to say Ehud in Hebrew. You got to be German or Dutch or something. You got to get some guttural stuff going, a little saliva in your throat. It's Ehud. Hebrews got a lot of gutturals. Ehud. Okay, Ehud of Benjamin. The people of Benjamin are under the oppression of a Moabite warlord. Now, Moab is on the east side of the Jordan River, but they're crossing the river and encroaching into the heartland of Israel. They have captured the city of palms. Now, the city of palms is what we better know as the city of Jericho. I'm not sure, depending on your translation of the Bible, whether it says Jericho or City of Palms. I don't know if you even noticed that, but City of Palms is an ancient name for Jericho. In any case, the Israelites are under oppression for about 18 years, and so Ehud has been selected to carry tribute money. That's basically what it means to be a vassal. You got to pay. What happens in these ancient relationships is a lot like what happens to the laundry in Detroit. These big guys come into your laundry and they say, you need protection. And you say, I don't need protection. They say, yes, you do. Because if you don't get protection, your windows could be broken. Nobody's breaking our windows. Crash. Well, they have now. You need protection. We have another word for it. We call it extortion. Okay. Basically, that's what's happening in the ancient world. They take over and they say, you need protection. And you have to pay for that protection. You have to pay pretty big, actually. So Ehud is going to carry the tribute money to Eglon. And Ehud is left-handed. Did you notice that in the story? That's important because most people, even in the ancient world, are right-handed. But if you're left-handed, people are watching your right hand. I mean, if they don't know what your preference is, they're going to watch your right hand because that would be where usually the threat is going to happen. Ehud keeps his right hand out there in the open, but he's got something else going on with his short sword. So he conceals a dagger on his thigh, and he comes in, he pays the tribute, leaves, but then doubles back under the pretext of delivering a private message. Well, what is happening to Eglon when Ehud comes back? He's having a private moment in his bathroom. And Ehud is ushered in, and he stabs him right where he sits and kills him. Now, the doors are locked on the inside. So how's he going to get out of there? It's one thing to kill the guy, but you got to get away. Okay, so how does he get out of there? There is a Hebrew word. This is one of these early words we don't know what it means. It's the Hebrew word misdaron. And this is the only place it appears in the Hebrew Bible, and we don't know what it means. But we have a theory about what it might mean. And that is, if he is in his inner chamber, which is essentially his bathroom, which is on a raised sort of structure, what is the one way to get out of there without unlocking the doors?
You have to go down. You
got to go down through the toilet hole, which is not a happy thought. Well, it's kind of funny too, but it isn't a very happy thought. So most scholars assume that the misdaron has to do with what we would call a toilet seat. In any case, Ehud gets out of there. The other people can't get in because the door's locked, and they keep calling out, and they think, well, you know, I don't want to embarrass the king, and it's taking quite a long time here, but we'll give him some time. By the time they finally get in and discover he's dead as a hammer, Ehud is gone. So that was the first big cycle deliverance of one of the Israelites who assassinates this guy.
Did he slip in there? Ehud slipped into this room?
No, they let him in through the doors, but then he locked it behind him. It was locked behind him. And then now he's got to get out. Well, theoretically, it could be a window, but on a raised platform. It basically says he was alone in the upper room. This is in chapter 3 and verse 20. He was in the upper room of his summer palace, which probably means that it's built as a second story or on some sort of posts or something like that. And so a window from the second floor is a lot more difficult to manage than a window from the first floor, because you got to drop, you know, maybe a dozen feet without breaking your ankle. So we're not really sure about that. So I wouldn't rule out window because we don't actually know what this word means. but most archaeologists tend to think it refers to the other because we actually know they had such things as toilet seats. They were stone, but several of them have been actually excavated by archaeologists, so we know that they existed. Okay, so that's one reason we think that could be the case here.
I have a question.
Sure.
It sort of goes back to my earlier question.
Yeah.
So when Eglon had overtaken it says the Israelites, but was it the Israel nation, or was it just in that area?
Probably in the central land, yeah. I mean, they would all be Israelites one way or another, but it's probably the central area that he's dealing with, yeah.
Okay. So.
Yeah. So they're not bringing tribute from probably all the tribes. They're bringing tribute primarily from the Benjamites and those in the central hill lands. Yeah.
Would it not have been a special tunnel of some sort in those eras that they had in all the different...
You mean for a secret entrance or exit?
Yeah.
Well, some palaces did have such things, so I wouldn't rule that out. Yeah. Most of the ones we know about, however, in fact, all of the ones we know about are from quite a bit later than this. So we're not sure whether they had any secret tunnels, at least in Canaan, at this early period. If we discover one, that would become another option for Mizraim. But so far we haven't. Yeah.
On this one, on my Bible, it says, in reference to that, because it says on here, then Ehud closed and locked the doors of the room and escaped down the latrine.
Sure, that is a scholarly guess.
Yeah.
That's not because we know what this word means, that's because of what we think it probably means.
And then it says here, it says, and went through the porch. The meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain.
Yeah, okay, there you go.
Porch, so you porch with a hole.
Something like that, yeah. So it's an uncertainty, but in the actual text of and you're reading what version? Is that the ESV?
NLT.
NLT, okay. So you're reading a modern version, and so they've actually decided to go with the archaeological kind of guess, but footnote it, so you know that there are some alternatives. Yeah, that's pretty typical of modern language versions. They try to do that. They will often give you something in the text, but if there's a question about it, they'll footnote it and give you your options. Okay, now we get to Deborah of Ephraim in chapters 4 and 5. Two forms of the story. There is a narrative form, and then there's a poetic form. Probably not composed at the same time, because the actual Hebrew in the two forms are fairly different. It's hard to tell that in English, but I can, since you don't have any way to check me out, you have to take my word for it, I guess. But anyway, they are different in Hebrew. And so there's this prose narrative, this poetic song, and the double account in many ways is similar to the crossing of the Red Sea, where there's a narrative and then there's a poem account. If you go back to that, you have that same kind of thing going on. And actually in the poem in Exodus, you have the same thing as you do in the book of Judges. The poem in Exodus about the Red Sea crossing seems to be much older than the narrative that precedes it, because of the language that's used and the difficult vocabulary. So it seems to be very old. Hebrew starts finalizing itself about the 14th century BC. So we're not too much after that, actually, in the period of the Judges. Prior to 1400 BC, there was a lot of looseness in the Hebrew language. For one thing, it had 3 or 4 more letters in the alphabet than ended up in the alphabet. So by the 1400s, the other extra letters, they've kind of got rid of those. They've also decided they're going to write from right to left instead of left to right. Prior to 1400, we find texts in Hebrew that are written both directions, one right to left, one left to right, and actually a couple of texts that are as the ox plows, right to left and then left to right and then right to left and then left to right. So it's going back and forth like this. That's something that faded away, and by around 1400 more or less, then Hebrew is standardized with a standard alphabet, standard orientation. But you have a lot of, anytime a language is going through that kind of change, you usually have a few holdovers from the older period. We do the same thing in English. We have holdovers in English from Middle English. And so that's why you probably have in these older poetic sections some of these old words that are difficult for us. So, in the time of Deborah, the northern Israelites are going to be oppressed by Hazor, the city of Hazor, which is where the red dot is, up north of the Sea of Galilee. So it kind of puts you on the map geographically. We know a fair amount about Hazor from the ancient world. This particular text is from the Egyptian execration text of the 19th century, which is roughly 500 years before our period, but it mentions Hazor by name. This is a letter from about the time we're talking about that addresses Hazor also. This is similar to an Amarna letter, which is an Egyptian Canaanite correspondence. So Hazor is a well-known city in the ancient world in texts besides the Bible. The combatants are Deborah. By the way, her name means the bee. Anybody here named Deborah? No? Okay. And Barak, his name means lightning. He's not really eager to go into this unless she goes with him. So he believes she's got the edge here, and he's willing to go if she will go. But the text says, well, since you didn't want to go by yourself, that means a woman's going to get credit for this, which in the ancient patriarchal world is a big deal. 21st century, not that big a deal, but it's a really big deal back then. So the army of Jabin is led by this warlord named Sisera, who has a huge chariot corps. And there is also in the story a group called the Kenites, because there's going to be this woman named Jael, who is a Kenite. Most of the Kenites are on the side of Jabin and Sisera, but apparently there's one clan that seems to favor the Israelites, and that's the one where Jael is. Okay? So they're gonna fight over near Mount Tabor. This is Mount Tabor in Galilee. You see that round top mountain? That's Mount Tabor, and because this picture is taken kind of in early morning, or maybe it's late evening, I'm not sure, but in any case you kind of see the rolling terrain, kind of the way the land looks. So Jael is going to be the final actor in this war. The forces of the Israelites are successful in putting Sisera and his army they're routing them and they're running. And Sisera, the enemy general, decides to get out of his chariot and run on foot. Now, why would he do that? Probably because he's now in some mountainous terrain where chariots don't work so good. He can go better on foot than with the chariot and horses. And as he is escaping, he's assuming he's safe if he's going to be with a Kenite family. And he finds a Kenite family, enters the tent of Jael, and decides this is a good place that I can rest and sort of refresh myself. So he goes to sleep. She feeds him some milk and so on. And she quite literally nails him with a tent stake. While he's sleeping sideways, apparently, she drives it right straight through his temples, and he's a goner. Tough gal. This is a gal you want to have with you when you got to walk through a dark alley in Detroit. I mean, this tough gal here. So I don't know, we don't really have time for this question, but you can take it back. What do you make of the central role of women in this story, particularly Deborah and Jael, with regard to ancient patriarchal society, which is a very hierarchical, male-dominated society? Obviously, God's not bound by those cultural customs, so he does it differently in this particular case. So that brings us to the end of the lesson 1, and actually I'm about 4 minutes early.
Any questions?
We might have some last questions, or maybe not.
Do you guys know what timeline, when you look at a timeline, when do the stories occur? We talked about when it was written, like there was already a king, so it's written much later, but the occurrence of the stories are what time? Remember, when was the Exodus? 1446. They were how long in the wilderness?
40 years.
40 years. So we are now at 1406. And then we have the conquest of the land. How long did that take?
8 years, 7 years.
7 years. So we are now, we're knocking down 40. We're knocking down roughly, of course, the conquest of 7 years. So we are now going to be in the 1300s. And then when we come to Saul, would be 1050. So we are roughly 300 plus years. That is the era of the judges.
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
So you have a time frame.
Yep.
As I look at the map, I see Hazor way up north. And
Yes.
yet Deborah was from the tribe that was more central.
Yeah, she is, but she's still in the upper area here. So we're not sure whether...
Since she was from the hill country of Ephraim.
Right, well, the hill country of Ephraim. Let me go back to, I wonder if I can get back to that. Maybe I could probably do it faster here this way. Go back to that map. There we go. Now let's try this. So Ephraim